and welcome. If you follow my channel, you will probably remember my S7 VRM project, which provides external CPU voltage for socket 7 motherboards as specified by Intel. From time to time I get back to that project, testing more mainboards for issues and compatibility. Some days ago I got an issue reported on the project site regarding a socket 7 mainboard from Intel, also known as Thor. Incidentally, I got this mainboard donated by Robert a while ago and it was waiting in my to-do box for a long time. Sorry, by the way, that it took so long to take a look at it.
Well, it's about fucking time!
Actually, I wanted to test my VRM module on this board, but it turned out to be dead, and so I parked it until I would have time to repair it first. Obviously, the ticket was a good reason to finally take another look at it. As you see, last time I left a notice to remind myself that there are some damaged traces on the board. Yeah, they are on the back. But let's have a brief overview of the board first. As you probably already recognized, this is an Intel 430FX chipset based mainboard, a very common chipset from the time when socket 7 was just arriving and dual voltage CPUs like Intel Pentium MMX or AMD K6 were not yet available. So most of the boards from the time officially only supported single voltage CPUs. However, this board is somewhat special even regarding single voltage CPUs. If you take a look at this area, you will see that the onboard voltage regulator is a switching one, unlike on most other boards from that time, which used very hot and inefficient linear regulators. Those boards could technically run with CPUs up to 200 MHz, but the linear regulators would get very hot and usually needed a fan to keep them cool. This board, however, with its switching regulator is able to run with CPUs over 200 MHz and remain stone cold. I think this is the earliest board I have seen which actually uses a switching regulator for the CPU voltage. Today this is a standard, but back then it was a revolutionary feature. And as I said, I actually wanted to test my VRM module on this board and try a dual voltage CPU for which the onboard voltage regulator would not be sufficient. As I explained in my previous videos about the S7 VRM, starting with Pentium MMX, CPUs introduced dual voltage operation, one voltage for the core and one voltage for the I/O. For example, Pentium MMX core voltage is 2.8 volts and the I/O voltage is 3.3 volts. The 3.3 volts I/O voltage should be provided by the onboard regulator, which I already mentioned, but the 2.8 volts core voltage has to be provided by an additional external regulator, like my S7 VRM module. Luckily, Intel has already provided a place for a VRM header for an external regulator on this mainboard. However, as you see, it has to be soldered, and I see some resistors which have to be removed as well. But before I do that, I have to take care of the damaged traces on this board and get hopefully a posting system. There seem to be multiple scratches which are potentially breaking the traces. Here's the first one, which doesn't look too bad, except in this area. Here is another one, which also seems to be not critical. It is deep, but looks like not deep enough to break a trace. Here is a suspicious spot, where two traces seem to be squeezed together. A lot of short scratches are around the place, which all need to be checked. And here is the worst place so far. Here a deep scratch is crossing multiple traces. And also down here, there seems to be some damage too. Oh, and by the way, here is a spot which seems to have been fixed by somebody before. There is clearly a botch wire which has been made very professionally, maybe even at the factory. Here I found a few more scratches near the unpopulated joystick and audio ports. Those traces don't look too bad, but they are also not used and so not important as long as those parts are left unpopulated. The other area with scratches is quite large, and it would take a lot of time to clean every trace one by one. So I will use a bigger polishing tool and clean the whole area from the solder mask. That should make it easier to see the damage and test the connectivity of the traces. Here is a trick. When you polish the PCB, the removed solder mask dusts a lot and you can't see the traces very well. But if you spray some alcohol, it massively improves the visibility, and also the polishing is not quite so rough, which reduces the risk of damaging the traces even more. So luckily most scratches turned out to be not too deep, except this one. Here there are 3 broken traces visible, even with a naked eye. Before fixing those, I'll tin all the polished traces, since polishing those areas of course weakened them a bit, and tinning will make them stronger and also easier to solder board wires where needed. It is always a pain in the back to solder board wire to 2 traces which are so close to each other. Of course, I could solder a wire around it, but this is a challenge which I like to take. So, connectivity is restored on all of the broken traces which I could find. Let's clean up and cover the area with a bit of nail varnish for protection. Okay, it's not beautiful, but if it works, I'm happy. For the first test, let's use a non-MMX Pentium CPU. I have here a Pentium 166 MHz. A post analyzer is always a good idea too. And of course, we need some RAM. Pentium uses 64-bit memory interface, so we need 2 SIMs. I believe I have here 2 8 MB sticks. We will also need the power supply, and I'll add a power switch for convenience. Oh, and the PC speaker in case there will be any beeps. Let's go. And would you look at that? Seems like it's back from the dead. But instead of a thank you, it complains about the missing graphics card. Here I have a simple PCI Cirrus Logic graphics card which should do the job. And there is an image. This still makes me happy every time when a hardware awakens after a repair. Seems to need some password to continue. Of course, I have no clue. So, on the board there is a jumper which enables or disables the password. This table also says that the setup can be disabled. Of course, we don't want that, so let's set the jumpers to enable the setup and disable the password. Hey, Gateway 2000! Didn't see that logo since a while. The password request is gone indeed, and the BIOS setup is accessible too. Great! Okay, I can do further tests later. Now let's come back to the actual reason of today's repair, the external VRM. As I said, this board has a single voltage regulator which provides 3.3 volts to the CPU. Dual-core CPUs like Pentium MMX would get quite hot at 3.3 volts and need a lower core voltage of 2.8 volts. Let's measure the provided voltage now on the VRM header footprint, which is currently unpopulated. Yeah, 3.3 volts as expected. So, the VRM would go here like so. And we can already see the first design issue on this board. The VRM header is placed in such a way that the components are facing the CPU. And if there are some tall capacitors on the VRM, they will interfere with the CPU cooler. Luckily, I have also a prototype where I used some lower profiled capacitors. Now I will have to remove the resistors which connect the core and I/O voltage planes together and solder the pin header for the VRM. As I said previously and explained in my previous videos about the S7 VRM, the pre-MMX Pentium CPUs required only one voltage, which was 3.3 volts. The MMX CPUs, however, have been made in more modern manufacturing processes and required lower core voltage of 2.8 volts. To stay compatible with the older hardware, Intel had to use 3.3 volts for the external I/O and 2.8 volts internally for the CPU core. This mainboard was released before the MMX CPUs were available on the market, and so it officially only supported 3.3 volts CPUs. However, it was prepared for the future and had a place for an external VRM header, which is not populated as you can see. Those resistors are connecting the core and I/O voltages together and have to be removed before the VRM can be used. So the resistors are gone and the solder holes for the pin header are cleaned. The CPU is a Pentium 166 which has only one voltage plane, so internally it connects the core and the I/O voltage together. And before I can check if the related pins are disconnected from each other, I have to remove the CPU. The core voltage plane now seems to be disconnected from the onboard voltage regulator. Very nice. The I/O voltage plane is also no longer connected to the onboard regulator. Okay, let's solder the pin header for the VRM. Nice, the pin header is in place. The VRM module is tested and works fine. All the switches are set off, so the VRM should deliver 1.4 volts. Seems like we are still getting 3.3 volts from the onboard regulator. That's strange. I probably overlooked something. Let's check the pin header once again. Okay, I overlooked something indeed. I checked if the core and the I/O voltages are disconnected from the 3.3 volts onboard regulator, but I didn't check if the two voltage planes are actually disconnected from each other. And they are not. Those 4 pins are going to the I/O voltage plane, and these 8 pins are the core voltage plane. And those 2 blocks of pins are still connected. There have to be some more resistors which need to be removed. I searched for 0 ohm resistors around the CPU sockets which are connected to the core voltage pins of the VRM, and eventually could locate 3 resistors which come in question. There are actually more 0 ohm resistors around the CPU sockets, but only 3 are connected to the core voltage plane. Let's remove those. First is the R4K3. Okay, both solder points are still connected to the core voltage plane. Next one is the R5L1. At least this is what I believe to read on the PCB. The voltage planes are still connected. Okay, the next one is the R3M2, or whatever this inscription means. It is right between the CPU socket and the VRM header, as you see. Finally, the connection between the core and the I/O voltage planes has gone. Perfect. So there were 3 0 ohm resistors which connected those voltage planes. All in all, I had to remove 7 resistors on the board. 4 bigger ones directly on the VRM header and 3 smaller ones around the CPU socket. 1 right inside of the socket, 2 outside. Okay, let's give it another try. Oh, there are 3.7 volts on the VRM output. The good news is that it seems not to be connected to the 3.3 volts onboard regulator anymore. The bad news is that I didn't expect to see 3.7 volts. Okay, my bad. I thought all the switches of the VRM were off, but in fact they were all on, which sets the output voltage to 3.7 volts. So that was an expected result. Now the switches are all off and the output voltage should be 1.4 volts. And there we go, 1.4 volts. Very nice. Let's flip the first switch to raise the voltage to 1.5 volts. Perfect. Second switch, 1.7 volts. Very nice. Okay, for the Pentium MMX we need 2.8 volts. That means off, on, off. Yep, looks right. And we are getting perfect 2.8 volts core voltage. Awesome! Let's check the I/O voltage. Still 3.3 volts as expected. That voltage comes from the onboard regulator. Okay, time to get real. Here I have a Pentium MMX 200. Let's try it. There we go, the design flaw is obvious. On most boards the VRM module is facing away from the CPU, but not on this one. The multiply is yet to be set correctly. Current setting is 2, which adds up to 133 MHz for the frontside bus of 66 MHz. For 200 MHz, we would need multiply of 3. This board is from the time where 166 MHz was the fastest CPU, and as you see from this table, 2.5 is the highest officially supported multiplier. However, the last entry in the table says RSVD, which probably means reserved. And I would bet that this is the multiplier 3, which we need for the 200 MHz. Let's try it. And the numbers are running. That means that the CPU gets the required voltage. But it seemed to get quickly warm and needs a cooler. Let's fix that. Well, this board is from the early times of ATX, and it doesn't provide a connector for the fan. Doesn't matter. For a short test, the heatsink alone should be enough. Let me also add a compact flash card with the DOS for a brief test. And here we go. The CPU is running at 200 MHz as I assumed. The reserved multiplier setting is indeed 3. Oh, and it seems even directly to auto-detect the compact flash. Well, DOS is booted. Let's run the CPU identification tool. Intel Pentium MMX at 200 MHz. Perfect. Of course, the obligatory benchmark on this channel. Doom runs at 964 ticks. Should be around right for a Pentium MMX 200 without level 2 cache. Once again, let's double check the voltage. 2.8 volts on point and stable. Okay, I think we can put the Intel Thor mainboard to the list of supported boards. Not only does it seem to implement the VRM specification properly, but unlike most other boards from that time, it even provides multiplier 3 out of the box, even though it is hidden under the reserved setting. After removing some resistors and soldering the pin header, the S7 VRM works here flawlessly and provides the required core voltage for the MMX CPU. The last question which I would like to check today is if this board supports an AMD K6-2 CPU which would work at 400 MHz. Let's try it out. The VRM has to be set to 2.2 volts. That would be off, 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 on, off. So everything is connected again. Let's fire it up. And the post is frozen. Let's double check the core voltage. 2.2 volts, it's perfectly fine, so at least that is not the reason for the freeze. I'm afraid this board's BIOS doesn't support the AMD K6-2. Probably it has a check which prevents it from booting with unknown CPUs. Let's insert a Pentium CPU again to be able to boot into DOS and try to update the BIOS. On the retro web, there are a couple of BIOS versions available. The board I got is the OEM one by Gateway with the BIOS version 103. The same one is listed here. Let's go directly to the latest 106. So I unpacked the installation package from the retro web and it seems to have a custom update utility. The instructions say that the content has to be written to a floppy, but let's try to run it directly from the drive C. There is this auto-exec bot which would normally run from the boot disk. It simply starts the update utility, so let's do it manually. We want to update. The file is 1006cn0. Yes, version 1.106. Looks good. Continue with programming. The selected flash data file cannot be used for updating flash memory. Either this flash data file is invalid for this system or the information contained in this file is corrupted. That's bad. Probably because this is an OEM board, the BIOS update utility doesn't want to install a generic BIOS version. Okay, I searched a little bit if the update utility can be somehow convinced to force install a non-OEM BIOS version, but I didn't find a way. Luckily, the RetroWeb provides also MR BIOS as an option. The BIOS versions are usually even better, so let's try to take the latest version 3.30. So here is the content of the MR BIOS package. Let's start the update utility. BIOS for Intel Triton ATX with S3 graphics and crystal sound. Well, this board has a place for graphics and sound chips, but they are not populated. Let's just hope that it will work. Type OK. OK. Let's back up the original version first, just in case. Now upload. The file we need is called Mr. or mr_atx.bio. Hey, and look at that! MR BIOS says hello. Obviously the update was a success. RTC battery is empty indeed, so that's okay. Nice overview. The CPU is running at 133 MHz, that's right. Well, many settings to discover. Let's first try to boot into DOS. The compact flash card seems to be detected properly. The system boots, but HiMMC detects a memory error. That is strange. Let me reinsert the memory once again. Maybe a bad contact. Nope, same thing. Let's take a look in the BIOS settings. First, let's deactivate the floppy drive so it doesn't try to search that. The compact flash card is detected properly, as I already mentioned. Let's see what else we can find. Ports, security, cache is enabled. Shadow, okay. Chipset. Oh, look at this. Memory type is set to 55 nanoseconds, but the modules which are inserted now are 60 nanoseconds. That could be the explanation. Let's set it to 60 and try once again. Bam! No memory error anymore. Nice. Let's finally try the K6-2 again. Aha, that seems to post. Very nice. What does MR BIOS say? It is a Pentium 651 MHz, of course. Looks like it has problems to detect it properly. The multiplier 10 is reported, but actually it is set to 2. And AMD K6-2 interprets multiplier 2 as 6. If you don't know why, I made a row of videos about the S7 VRM and benchmarks of Intel versus AMD Socket 7 CPUs. If you are interested, feel free to take a look. The battery is still empty, so the BIOS settings have to be set after every power cycle. Okay, back in DOS, and the CPU identification reports K6-2 at 400 MHz as expected. Let's take the usual Doom write once again. 859 real ticks. It is only 10% better than the Pentium MMX 200 before. Obviously, the bottleneck on this system is not the CPU. Currently, the system has no level 2 cache installed. There are no chips on board and the coast module is not inserted. The cache check also reports only level 1 cache of 32K, which is right. Let's insert a coast module and run Doom once again. Oh, looks like the level 2 cache hasn't been detected. In the cache settings there is also nothing suspicious. And cache check also reports only L1 cache again. Is this a MR bias error? I flashed back the original gateway bias and it seems to report 256K level 2 cache. I checked on the RetroWeb once again and there were different versions of this board. Some seem to have had onboard cache, others had a coast slot. Maybe there was a difference in the bias. There is another version of MR bias, 3.28. Let's try that and see if the level 2 cache will be detected there. Hey, and look at that, it actually does report 256K of cache. Cool. And here as well, 256K external cache. Let's again insert the K6-2 and try to benchmark Doom with level 2 cache. Oh boy, external cache is not reported anymore. Such a bummer. Probably due to a not properly detected CPU, the external cache support is not activated by this version of BIOS. That's really a shame. I was actually able to install the latest AMI BIOS version 1.06. If you remember, the official utility didn't want to overwrite an OEM BIOS, so I looked into the folder, in particular at the two files which contain the BIOS dump. Each file is 65,664 bytes long, where the first 128 bytes seem to be some metadata for the update utility. So I cut off the first 128 bytes from both files and combined the rest into one 131,072 bytes file, which corresponds exactly to 128 kibibytes, the required BIOS size for this board. I compared the outcome with the original gateway BIOS, which I saved previously, and the structure seems to match. So I took the risk and flashed the result using MR BIOS flash utility, and that didn't complain. After a reboot, the gateway logo disappeared and the BIOS greeted with version 1.06 CN0, as I was hoping. In the BIOS I found the report of 256K level 2 cache. But unfortunately also this BIOS version didn't want to work with K6-2 and froze at exactly same postcode as the gateway OEM BIOS. So this video got a lot longer than I planned. Let's summarize briefly. On the good side, this board is back to life. It properly implements Intel's own VRM specs, and I was able to locate the related resistors and equip it with a VRM. Also, this is another board on the list which can be officially reported as supported by my Socket 7 VRM project. Also, MR BIOS seems to be a better option for this board than the original AMI, even compared to the latest version which I was able to reassemble. And not only are there more settings in MR BIOS, it also is actually able to post with an AMD K6-2. On the bad side, for some reason, level 2 cache doesn't work with K6-2, which would have a significant impact on the overall performance of this system. However, I guess K6-2 Plus or K6-3 Plus can be used with their integrated level 2 cache, so the missing onboard level 2 cache would be actually not a big deal. And this is it for today. I guess I can close this ticket on the project site with a positive note. And I hope you enjoyed this investigation. Thank you for your comments. They are not only exciting to read, but also help the channel to grow. As always, thank you for watching and goodbye.